questions. And then I can see comments coming in, and I'll bring those in as well. All right, welcome this evening. Welcome to this important conversation. I am excited to have you here. As you're coming in, we'll give people time to come in. If you're coming in, please say hello in the comments. As you come into the room, say hello, say where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. And as we go through the evening and this conversation, feel free to drop in your comments, your questions, your observations of our discussion, this important conversation tonight. As I said, as you're coming in, I see several of you now joining, getting those notifications. We're so glad to have you on YouTube, of course. Thank you, Facebook and Twitter and Periscope, for jumping in, and especially the people on Twitch. I know this is not in your wheelhouse, but we're so glad to have our friends on Twitch in the room as well. Feel free to, as you come in, drop your a hello in the comments and where you're watching from. Love to say hello. So the other thing I'd love to have you do is grab the link right now before we get started for this presentation. Grab the link and share it out on Twitter, Facebook, wherever you are. If you're on YouTube, grab the link from your browser and tweet it out or share it out so others can join the conversation as well as we get started this evening. And as we go, as we're conversing and talking about this important topic, definitely drop your comments and your questions in the comments section, and I'll be happy to bring those into the conversation. As we get started tonight, I kind of want to lay a little bit of a framework for this conversation. In the last 3 to 4 months, the world has really been shocked by the atrocity of these murders of our Black fellow citizens. And many of us have been literally in the streets, just shocked at this. And it's important that we experience this shock. But the sad thing is that this trauma is primarily been reserved for us as white people. These atrocities have been going on for decades and centuries. And so these injustices, as they are coming to our awareness, we are experiencing something many of us haven't experienced before, and that is the awareness of our privilege and the things that protect us from this experience. It's important for us, I believe, as white people to deal with our stuff. We created the systems and beliefs and the shackles of oppression that restrain others, and it's important for us to take care of this business. It's hard, but others have been doing this work far too long. And if you're devastated by this experience, as is human, and the things that you've witnessed in the last 2 to 3 months, and you don't know how we got here, I'm inviting you to stay with us through this hour. You will find out exactly how we got here. And you, at the end, may feel lied to. You may feel manipulated. You may feel frustrated, overwhelmed, and maybe even a little bit defensive. You may be even feeling defensive already this evening. I want you to know that's normal. Research shows that when we as white people become aware of our privilege, we often feel overwhelmed and helpless, which leads us then to become defensive. So I would invite you to open your heart with me this evening as we go through this topic and this conversation. And as you feel those feelings, recognize that they're normal and that's okay, but it's important to feel that. You are not helpless. So take some deep breaths and stick with us, because tonight I'm excited to have Dr. Angie Maxwell on the show. She is the director of the Diane D. Blair Center for Southern Politics and Society and an associate professor of political science at the University of Arkansas. She's also the Diane D. Blair Chair of Southern Studies at the university and the co-author of The Long Southern Strategy: How Chasing White Voters in the South Changed American Politics. Buckle in, because tonight we're going to do 2 things your mom probably told you to never do, and that's talk religion and politics. Join me in welcoming a researcher and a writer that I have great respect for. Dr. Angie Maxwell, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
It's going to be an exciting ride, and I have pages of notes. I, in the last week, have gobbled up both of your books. If you, for the audience, you need to get The Indicted South. It lays the framework for what then is built on in The Long Southern Strategy. The Long Southern Strategy does a deep dive into the data that really show how we got where we are. Both really, really excellent reads. I have to tell you, Angie, just as a point of pride for you as a researcher and author, when I picked up this book after reading the other one, with Indicted South, I saw myself and I was like, wow, I'm a non-native Southerner. And I was shocked, really. And when I picked up The Long Southern Strategy, I was about 8 pages into the introduction. And I had to walk away, and I was heavy breathing kind of through my apartment. And my partner's like, what is going on? I said, this is so well written. It's so well written.
Thank you.
So I know that you and Dr. Todd Shields have put a lot of work into this, and shout out to him as well for his impeccable work in this, and really encourage the audience. You got to get it. It's really good. So as we go into this conversation, I want to set a kind of a context for our audience. And on page 8, literally, of the Southern Strategy, you lay out a context that I think is helpful. You describe white Southernness as a triptych. Can you kind of dive into the 3 kind of main components of this this whiteness that is that you recognize in the South, and kind of lay out that framework for us?
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of components of Southern identity, and we tend to default think of Southern as white, but of course we have a large portion of African Americans who claim a Southern identity. We have a portion of Latinos that claim a Southern identity. And so what I want to be specific, that we're really talking about Southern white identity, because that is, it's its own thing, right? And unfortunately, the major components of it that have been politicized and have allowed it to continue generation to generation are not the good parts. And there are some good things, right? Sense of family, sense of community, all that kind of stuff. Good. But it's the bad pieces that unfortunately is what got politicized. So those are, kind of a zero-sum racial outlook, right? So pitting whites against an other. And that has kind of morphed and changed over time. Racial resentment, all of that. The second is an anti-feminism, or a proponent of traditional gender roles, not choice, but the imposition of traditional gender roles. And that has been carried on by men and women, and Southern white women. We have a lot of male feminists too, right? Or men that believe in equal choices for women, right? No matter what they choose. So I just want to be clear about that. And then the last is kind of a Christian nationalism. It's a kind of, I hate using the term necessarily fundamentalism and evangelicalism, because you've got Christian evangelicals who aren't Christian nationalists, right? But this is really the component of, this should be no separation of church and state. It should be what we're advocating for in foreign policy. It should be what we're passing legislation backed about, right? A Christian nationalism. And most often it's fundamentalists, right? But not always, right? And I just want to say also that one of the reasons that we use the data is because we don't want to overgeneralize, right? We want to give the numbers. So it's just important to remember as you're listening, if you're one of the people that, there's a 30-40% of white Southerners that don't express this, modern sexist attitude. That's a lot of people. That's millions of people. Okay. So that's one of the reasons we put the numbers in there. But when it's over you're over majority and over 60%, any percent of that is a problem, right? But I get a lot of that. I get a lot of people go, but and I get that. I'm a native born white Southerner too. I get it. There's pieces that are true for me. There's pieces that are not, right? And so it's more about trying to see not just our individual lives, but the collective structure that's been built by it. too. So,
and as
just wanted
we
to say that up
and
front.
that's part, I'm glad you made those distinctions, because it's important when we talk about how it influenced the politics of our nation. And it's interesting, when I first saw you speak when the book was released last year, and you laid out the data very pragmatically and very succinctly. And when I would describe the book to people, I would say it's really about the Republicanization of the South. And when I read the book, I realized it's actually the opposite. It was the Southernization, or the white Southernization of the Republican Party. And so I'm glad you made that distinction, because I think it's important. And one of the other distinctions I'd like you to kind of address is something you address in the book, that this isn't just a Southern problem anymore. Southern whiteness is just not a Southern thing. You quote Leanne Duck in your book, The Indicted South, and she points out that when we talk about America nationally, we tend to talk about our democracy, the more perfect union, and we have these things that we ascribe to or aspire to. And when we think about or talk about the South, we localize it and we almost other it or segment it, and it's the beleaguered South, or it's the backward South, or it's the hillbilly South, or whatever it is.
Right.
And so, can you talk about why that's reductive and it's really impractical for confronting the impact of kind of the Southern way of life on politics, and the American psyche, really?
Yeah, absolutely. So, two things. First, and I describe this a lot in The Indicted South, but, you know, the country throwing all of the criticism on the South, right? The South becomes a way of kind of, as Christopher Lasch says, exercising our national sins, right? So it's important to note up front that everything I write about is not exclusive to the South. It's denser, it's more consistent, right? It's in larger numbers, but it has no geographic, boundaries. I mean, racism and anti-feminism and Christian nationalism have no geographical limitations, right? But the reason the South is so important to our national politics, and this story about what the Republican Party chose to do, is because it's going to nationalize that those not good aspects of Southern culture. Now, why did that happen? Well, you know what we do after an election where your person loses. I mean, the postmortem for months. Why do we lose, right? The Republican Party after 1960, when Nixon lost so narrowly to JFK, and Nixon had run a pro-civil rights campaign, very much so. There's a lot of hand-wringing in the Republican Party saying, what did we do wrong? And there was a split. There was kind of a whole group of strategists that were saying, we've got to break this solidly Democratic South. Now, there have been a few states go different ways, but overall it's just solid. Let's break that up, right? Or there were others that said there's no way, we're not going to do that. We need to pick up stuff in the West, or, in the Midwest. But in the end, the strategists that really wanted to cut that path through the South not only won the day, but their candidate that they wanted to get to do it, Barry Goldwater, got the nomination in this huge split between the kind of pro-civil rights Republicans of Nelson Rockefeller and the Barry Goldwater folks that wanted to shut a lot of that down, right? And so you've got all these pro-civil rights Republicans that are kind of distraught, like, where's our party going, right? I mean, we see a lot of factions in the Democratic Party now, right? So similar. But in order to win those Southern white voters, Goldwater's Operation Dixie decided to really play up that Goldwater had voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that he would not sign a Voting Rights Act, right? That was going to come the next year in 65. And so all of a sudden, after all of this solid Democratic voting since almost Reconstruction, five deep South states flip Republican. In Mississippi alone, Goldwater gets 87% of the vote.
Wow.
I mean, there's never been a state that flipped like that. I mean, that's never happened in those numbers, right? And a lot of the African American vote is still suppressed because we don't have a Voting Rights Act yet. And so, but Goldwater loses, basically everywhere else except his native Arizona So the next election cycle, 68, Republicans are like, do we do this again? They're really debating. And when George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, decides to run, then they're really in a pickle, because he's going to pull. So Nixon decides to kind of skate the middle, and he tweaks Goldwater's kind of anti-civil rights message into a law and order. Let's just slow this down. A benign, things are moving too fast. It's benign neglect. It's very polished. It's not what we're seeing right now from this current administration, which is very inflamed. It's not that. It's very coded.
Yeah.
Right.
And he laid that foundation.
And Nixon wins the South. And then, long story short, that's kind of where we stop. But Jimmy Carter is going to win the whole South back. The Republicans are going, whoa, what do we do? They're going to double down this time, tweak their racial coding, and add an anti-feminist message. And they're going to win a whole bunch, particularly of Southern white women, back. But then Bill Clinton is going to erode those gains again. And then the GOP is going to hit that triptych and really push hard on kind of a Christian nationalism. And so it's when the three things come together that we see not only victories for the Republican Party at the national level in the presidency, but it trickles down to state and local, where we see the South fully kind of red from the top down. Now, what that means is the Republican Party rebranded itself that way in this Southern kind of white style. It was the style of politics, too, the us versus them, the kind of big rallies and demagoguery. I mean, all that is very traditional in the South. And so that meant that conservatives throughout the country, their Republican Party became that. And if they didn't leave, it pulled them along with it, right? And so it's a big part of kind of how, and I just want to say there were a lot of Republicans left behind. There were a lot of Republican feminists, of Republican, civil rights advocates that were left behind by this. It was not universal, and watch their party leave. And I always say that because to remind people that parties can change, so if you're, been lifelong invested in the GOP and you're unhappy with where it is now, it can change. And people can change it. Parties are fluid, and it's important to remember that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when you talked about what happened with Jimmy Carter and then Reagan and then Bill Clinton and Bush and this bounce back and forth, and the importance of the white Southern woman vote and influence. That's kind of where this discussion is framed around race because of all the things that have happened recently. But it helped me really, when I was reading your book, to understand the intersectionality of all this, and something you've already said, that these things fluctuate and depending on the decade or the candidate, they're emphasized in different ways. But it really is this kind of has been a winning strategy for the Republicans to be able to lean harder in one area or another. So I kind of want to dive deep into each of those as we go. And those of you that have joined us, I said at the beginning, but please feel free to drop your observations, comments, or questions in the comment section. I'm happy to bring those into our conversation as well. This triptych we talk about of kind of white supremacy, the anti-feminist component, and then the kind of Christian fundamental religiosity. I think you said is in the book that those influences. Let's kind of pick them up one at a time and dive, I think, into patriarchy, because we talked about the white women vote, and you talk at length about the myth of the Southern white womanhood. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what that is and how it affects what we're experiencing currently and what we see happening today.
Absolutely. Okay, so the myth of Southern white womanhood, this is an antebellum construct, goes back to before the Civil War, and it used the fragility of white women as a faux justification for white supremacy, right? So these white men had to use violence and have extreme, laws to protect against oppressing African American men in particular, to protect these fragile, white women. And women were kind of put up on a pedestal, these Southern white women. They were considered kind of the moral center of the home, and yet they were excluded from political discussions for the most part. So they were kind of seen and not heard, right? Now, so why does that matter long term? Well, because obviously it's a long time ago, but what happens is institutions creep up over time that continue to perpetuate that image and a rearing of young women in that capacity. So whether it was finishing schools, right, or debutantes or sororities or beauty pageants or any of these kind of junior leagues. And I know a lot of those things, not the Daughters of the Confederacy, all of these organizations that busied women, sometimes with some good service, but in a capacity that maintained this non-political, protected space, right? Now, there was a lot of white women that were not up on a pedestal, but the culture made a lot of them aspire to that, and I have deep empathy for that, because if you're working a labor job or a shitty job with terrible wages with no, career path, yeah, of course, it would be nice to not have to be with your children, right? If you're a mother, because not all work is meaningful work, right? Sometimes it's just work. So it also became aspirational in a lot of ways to women, working class white women. And it became the thing that, so what you get is you get generation after generation of women that aren't being asked or raised to go, what contribution are you going to make to the planet, right? Outside of the family. Like, what are you going to choose as a career? Or if you're going to choose motherhood, are you knowledgeable that you're choosing it? Are you conscious of what you're choosing? Because it's a perfectly wonderful choice if you get a choice, right? That's the point. So, but at the same time that this myth of Southern white womanhood, this woman on a pedestal, it demonizes African Americans as threatening, right? Mm-hmm. While propping up Southern white women is absolutely benefiting from it, right? But having no agency. Mm-hmm. And it creates a specific kind of white masculinity, right? Mm-hmm. Which is bravado, kind of a hyper masculine, I say in the book, kind of rebel badass, right thing. And so they all depend on each other, mm-hmm. right? But these white men could not justify their treatment of black men unless they could couch it in some kind of chivalry, whatever, right? Yeah. And so you create white women who don't speak up, mm-hmm. and you create men who continue to portray these things as a threat and this kind of hyper defensive masculinity, mm-hmm. and wonder where we go.
Yeah, and it bleeds over and continues. All of them, like I said, this is all intersectional, and it's so important to understand mm-hmm. how the elevation of this mythological white woman then protecting her from mm-hmm. the black man who we're mistreating horrendously in order to justify this is to protect this thing that doesn't really exist. And in a lot of cases wasn't being assaulted, even if it did exist.
Absolutely.
And,
absolutely.
So it's important. I found through the book, it was so important, even though I know some of these things, like understanding and then seeing how you and Dr. Shields broke out the numbers to show what was actually happening and how those things influence. Yes, it does.
I say in the book, like, if you look at Southern white women and their voting as late as 2018, I mean, 75% of Southern white women did not vote for Stacey Abrams in Georgia. They did not, right? And then the statistic that we always say about, Hillary Clinton lost white women, She actually won white women outside of the South, 52 to 48. She lost white women in the South by almost 30 points. Right? And so there's really two realities. And I've got to tell you, I really appreciate you letting me talk about this, because even in other, interviews and podcasts I've done, I feel like people jump from the race to the religion. And this is the part that the polling gets wrong. This is the part when we go, oh, well, there's a gender gap and women vote more Democrat. Finally, we started breaking that down by race. That took a long time. But if we don't break it by region, if you see a poll about what suburban, white women are doing voting, if they don't have a regional breakdown, right? It can move some. I'm not saying it won't, but it lags, right? So if you see a huge number, then there's probably some movement. It's just, if we cannot change what we don't acknowledge, and we have no research on Southern white women and their political behavior. None. We have nothing. And so it's just,
that's what I really appreciated about the Blair numbers and the research, the surveying, because you were able to break that down and talk about the specifics of what white women were doing and had done. And it's a lot of times we outside of the South, or even outside of kind of this mindset politically, think, oh, that was this time, or it was in that election, and it, like you said, it was as late as 2018 that we can see this. But you also
right.
broke down in like the South, people who identify as Southern outside of the South, and how
Yeah.
and so understanding all these components is really important, especially when you have something like that where, like you said, Clinton lost white Southern women 30%. Like that would, even if you gained half of that, it would have made
it's a game changer. Right.
a dramatic change.
Exactly.
I mean, it could have
And
flipped Florida. It could have, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And so it's just important. I mean, I cannot tell you how, it's so counterintuitive to people out that didn't grow up in the South sometimes, or hadn't been, when I say, you don't understand, the Republican Party, Reagan's team, polled 40,000 American women, divided them into 64 categories. They gave them names like Nancy's, Betty's, Helen's, and they pinpointed on the electoral map what did they need for him to pull the South back from Jimmy Carter. And they realized they could win more of the white women voters they needed by dropping the Equal Rights Amendment from their platform. And the Republican Party is the party that put it in the first place. They had it in there for 40 years, right? They led the charge. And devastating a bunch of Republican feminists. And people are like, wait, I don't understand. They won women by dropping the Equal Rights Amendment. And I was like, yes. Reagan picked up Southern white women voters and then picked more up in 84 by doubling down on traditional gender roles and playing them up, really strongly. And if we can criticize that or whatever, I actually have a lot of empathy for it. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of Southern white women got, the anti-feminist campaign scared them.
Yeah.
It told them they were all going to have to work. It told them they would put their kids in government daycare. Mm-hmm. That is a very personal and terrifying thing. And they didn't have any kind of institutional support. And if they believed that and they really heard that, I get, why that, kind of change feels so intrusive. I do, unfortunately it wasn't true.
Yeah.
It wasn't what the amendment said. It was scare tactics, but I have empathy for it.
Yeah. I think it's so important understanding, as you said, to understand these moving parts. And I want to bring in a comment. My friend Daniel's actually joined this. He says, I'm a big fan of Dr. Maxwell. The GOP took some of the worst traits of Southern culture. Can you describe some of the better elements of Southern culture? I'm a Californian. How a party could adapt them into a winning election or a governing strategy? So, for example, say the Democratic Party, if they were to leverage the strengths of the South, how could they do that?
That's a great question. I mean, if you look, for example, in Louisiana, right, who has, I mean, he's a conservative Democratic governor. I mean, he's a very, very middle, almost, you know, almost independent, but, one of that, Louisiana's got something they call, the Cajun Navy, right? It's all these guys with their boats that go in when there's hurricane. So that spirit of volunteerism, that we take care of our community, people who champion that, right? Who, too often we leave so much of the caretaking of our communities to private citizens, to churches and whatever. And, a campaign that, validates that, celebrates it, encourages it, champions it, funds it, right? Supports it, is just really powerful. There's a lot of non-denominational church organizations that are really reaching to a lot of young people. And I think that there are real inroads that could be made in that capacity. The Catholic Church used to be so strong on immigration. The Catholic Church and the nuns, that's these, not only they march in civil rights, but they would take in immigrants and families and work in, particularly in South America and Latin America, to get vocations for the priesthood and stuff like that. I mean, there are connections that can be made with, kind of some of the best groups. And as the Southern Baptist Convention right now has one of the first presidents, since 79, that's not just a diehard, fundamentalist, and is trying to get some conversation going about, racial reconciliation for a second time, one with more substance, right? I think you can use religion and faith in a way that is social gospel progressive, and that sense of family. The culture in the South too, rural people feel so left behind. It can be that, just like during the New Deal, that we want to turn the lights on, we want to turn the broadband on in these parts, we want to connect our neighbors, we want to give them access to things, because that's what we're about, right? Is you can live out in the world, you can disappear from the world but we'll always have a road to you, right? We'll always have a connection to you. You're not alone. Those kinds of things, neighbor, that sense of neighborly, all those good pieces, I think are meaningful in the region. And it's this kind of stuff like you saw Stacey Abrams do. I mean, it can be done.
Yeah.
It can be done. It just like the Republican Party took 40 years to flip the South completely, it just takes consistency and time and short-term goals and long-term goals, right?
Yeah, it's gonna take decades to continue to build and to change what we've built. And so we looked at the idea, this myth of the Southern white woman, and how that has impacted politics. On like about 100 pages into the book, you say whiteness is portrayed as meritocracy, despite being inaccessible to non-whites and based on nothing. So I want to talk now a little bit about this idea of white superiority. We all benefit from it, but a lot of us, some of us even till recently, are unaware. And even those that are aware, we're constantly becoming more and more aware of what that means. And, we don't realize until it's like, oh, not everybody has the same experience with this, with the civil justice system, or with even the workforce. Like, oh, I didn't realize, when you look at the numbers and there's this big gap between what someone my age, a black man my age, makes versus what I make, and it's like, oh, and it's systemic. So as can you talk in the book? You use the word several times, and I think even in the Indicted South, you use this idea of the cost and the heavy wage of white supremacy, especially Southern whiteness. This idea of Southern whiteness. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that again impacts us now?
Absolutely. So first I'll tell you it's really interesting because after this, as a political scientist, it's really hard to measure racism. Like, this is always a debate. How do you measure this? And we used to measure it using racial stereotypes. So, how trustworthy are African Americans, how hardworking, right? And you'd see whites give African Americans pretty low scores on those things, saying lazy, untrustworthy, right? Unintelligent. After the civil rights movement, we see those numbers really come up. And so people are going, wow, great. They start to believe there's something shifting. But then in the 1970s, political scientists start measuring something called symbolic racism or racial resentment, which is not racial stereotypes. It is a disbelief in the long-term systemic effects of the oppression that African Americans felt and had and experienced pre-civil rights. So it's kind of like, okay, well, that's done, right? We changed the laws, it's done. And now it's time to move past race. And it would be questions about, like, generations of slavery have made it difficult for African Americans to move ahead. No, that's not true, right? It's a kind of denial of that systemic racism. And so we see those numbers skyrocket, right? Now, that's a different thing. And I'm not saying there's not it's good that the racial stereotypes died down, but it got channeled in another direction, right? And the Republican Party knew this, right? So I'll come back to that one second. The other thing we saw is we started to measure something called ethnocentrism, which was measuring what's called a feeling thermometer. So we take your temperature on African Americans as a white person. What do you think? How would you rank, right? I feel about 75%, right? Okay. And we saw those numbers start to go up. That's good. But you know what else went up? How they felt about whites, right? So you saw white people give a really high inflated number for whites, and they gave a higher number for African Americans than they had in the past, but the gap stayed the same, right? And so that speaks to kind of I know that I should say something positive, but it's not until you ask them what they feel about whites that you can see, do they still see a superiority, right? And that's really important. So now going back to the kind of racial resentment measure that kind of looks at not believing in systemic racism, one of the things that the Republican Party did is it morphed its approach on race after Nixon and Law and Order is Reagan comes along and pitches colorblindness. Now, what's wrong with that? Oh, that sounds great, right? It's what Martin Luther King said. It's like, I just don't see color. But it was a very deliberate choice, because if you're colorblind and if the system is now colorblind, right, then there is no more funding or federal programs to try to dismantle structural racism, right? So now we don't need affirmative action, right, anymore. And now we don't need, right, any kind of Head Start programs or educational access or scholarship fund or anything, because we are ready to move past race, right? And if you move past race when whites are up here and think of themselves up here and think of African Americans here, and you move past it, then you are conserving the status quo. You are conserving it, right? And that is a really hard thing to combat, because it's such a powerful, it is a goal, right? But if we say we're there when we still have these issues, then it just halted progress. It just halted it. It also, if we're in a colorblind system and anything is done for African Americans, that becomes reverse racism against whites. And we see those claims skyrocket, which, kind of blows my mind, because if we're colorblind, then how are you experiencing reverse racism, right? But it was no more efforts to level the playing field. But it was packaged in a way that sounded very egalitarian. And so I have a lot of people wanted to believe that.
Yeah.
because they didn't want to do the work for it.
That's
And maybe they feel it
yep.
in their own heart. Maybe they do feel in their own heart, their own individual experience. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
hear all the time. But I have African American friends, and I have a, biracial child and our grandchild, and I love. Wonderful. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
The other thing the GOP did is push people to look at their individual lives only.
Mm.
And if it is not true for you, it starts with Goldwater. This individual, if it's not true for you, it must not be true. Right? It's like, I make equal pay.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean there's not a problem
Yeah.
with the gender pay gap? No. That's great that I do. That's what we want for everybody, right? Yeah. And just because you might treat people well in your own life does not mean that that is true everywhere else, right? And so people have a really hard time, though, sometimes merging, if it's not true for their own reality, kind of seeing it. And so I just challenge people to say, if you're a female who feels like you've never been discriminated against, that is fantastic. That's what we want for everyone. If you feel like you treat African American people well in your community, if you're a police officer who is very compassionate and very conscious about race, that is great. That is wonderful. That doesn't mean that you are everywhere, right?
The system is broken.
Yes. You can be a good cog, but the system can still be broken, right? And so we need those people more than ever because they're an example. Right? They're a model we can follow.
Well, and
right?
you said earlier, you talked about the zero-sum game that the GOP. So it's like an onion. There's all these layers of this strategy that have unfolded and they've become more and more sophisticated and nuanced as they realize, oh, this is working. And that's exactly my story and why I saw myself, because I grew up in the Midwest in Omaha, Nebraska. We're, like Arkansas, a very rural, community. I grew up in the city, but I didn't experience or see in my experience overt racism. I had no concept of systemic inequality or systemic racism at all.
Sure.
And so I literally went to college in the South thinking the Civil Rights Act happened in 1964, 65. I read about it in my history book. I read about the Little Rock Nine. It's a history. It was in my book. It was a thing, and it's done. And I grew up also in a very Republican household. So in the Reagan era. So all of this was like, you believed it until I got to college. And a roommate from Macon, Georgia used the N-word, and I'd never heard it in real life ever. And all of a sudden, it was that moment where I was like, oh, wow. And it was like the butt of a joke. And I was like, okay, that doesn't happen in front of me anymore. But then I realized, okay, but it's taken me 20 more years to get to where I am now, where I'm challenging more. And I think your point is really important, that it's okay to recognize, like, my own experience may not be, and it's okay to fight for systemic deconstruction and reconstruction of these systems in a more equitable way as well.
Yes, if you've got something, if you feel like you are a white person who is pretty, I guess, kind of woke on race and pretty conscious, or that you're good, you treat African Americans equally, or you're colorblind, one, if that's true, then we need you to help. And if it's something you think, then we need you to help, because in the helping, you're going to realize where you still have work to do.
Yep.
Right?
That's it. That's been my experience. So
it's like you plug in and you learn as you go, right? But thinking you've got it all figured out and sitting on the sidelines, it's just a missed opportunity in your own life, because you may, I know the history, right? I know the history. That's one piece.
Yeah.
I'm still learning.
Yeah.
I'm still seeing things every year
that
open my eyes, mistakes I make, things I say that, hit, very understandably triggers in African American colleagues that I need to apologize for, own, and do better.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you that it is a better feeling to try and to plug in than to deal with the anxiety of some kind of helplessness.
Yeah.
And because that to me, I'd rather die on the hill trying than to be a better person, to understand more, to do meaningful work, than to check out because it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's actually more uncomfortable to just sit back and be helpless doing nothing. I really believe that.
Especially once you see it and know it. And even if I've been in a place where I receive some education or see something where I'm not yet, to my own fault, just completely transparently, I'm not courageous enough. I'm just not in that place. But it's like a muscle. You build that over, and as you gain more understanding, how you said you learn something every year. A week or so ago, I saw something. I think it was on Twitter, maybe. There were some local discussions happening here in state, and somebody said something about even the words we use, how we talk about, those of us who think we have it, quote, figured out, and everybody needs a seat at the table. Even that expression is positioning someone, generally the white guy, as the arbiter of the seats at the table and who gets one, instead of, and again, it goes to that zero-sum idea that there's only so many seats and that everybody can't have a seat and a say and an impact.
There are very, very few things in life that are truly a zero sum. There really are. There's very few. And we have been, encouraged to think that way. But in our system, in this country, there is no reason that there is not enough. There's enough work to be done. There's enough power to share. There's enough, economic prosperity to go around. I wish we could shake off. If I could do one thing, I would say envision a world in which it's not a zero sum, because it's actually not. Yeah. It's actually all interdependent. Yeah. It absolutely is.
And historically, we've seen that as our economy becomes more and more sophisticated and more aggressive in some cases, there's always more, and it grows, and that's the way that's a natural process. I mean, nature is always regenerating.
It's kind of like parenting, it's like, I only have one child, but, I've had friends that were having a second child going, God, can I love this, it's going to take time and love for your heart expands. It's not a zero sum game. It's not, and it's the same way in our communities, but we get scared when we think it is, because of course everyone wants their family to do, everyone doesn't want something taken that they need, or I get it, I do.
Especially when our politicians are running specifically telling us the Democrats want to take this or Republicans want to take that.
And that's what it's going to. So I say to people all the time, and we poll on this about attitude towards Black Lives Matter and towards the police. And, you can wholeheartedly support Black Lives Matter and you can support good policing. They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
It's bad, racist, violent policing. That is the problem. It's like, it doesn't have to, you can support women in the workforce and choosing that path, and you can support women who choose to make that contribution at home. Right. Because it's a choice. Yeah. It's the choice.
And there's enough.
They do not have to be mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not.
So and this brings up a good question, Daniel, again, chiming in. Given America's demographic changes, does the long Southern strategy have an expiration date? What happens next?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, I will tell you this, that one thing we see with President Trump's numbers right now is that, particularly for women, so I'm not in any way going to say that, Southern white women are less racist or have less racist tendency or have less racial resentment than Southern white men. I'm not going to, but Southern white women tend to respond poorly to the fanning of the flames, right? So it's kind of like for Southern white women who feel that racial resentment, they really kind of want it coded. They do not like the outward, somebody make it a president that makes it worse, right? Mm-hmm. They like to Reagan, who goes, let's just move past race, right? And so if Trump starts losing some numbers with Southern white women, I think it's because the racism is so direct. It is so uncoded. And but I don't want us to take that necessarily as meaning people have had some kind of change of heart, right? It's that they don't want to be associated with something that fans the flames, right? So we saw Southern white women roll hard in the early 20th century against lynching, but it wasn't because they really wanted the racial status quo to change. They just didn't like those violent spectacles. Some did, but there was a group that didn't. But it didn't mean the same thing as true racial kind of, progress or believing. So I think that that's happening some, right? The demographic that is, so if you look at whites who test above average on the racial resentment scale and or the modern sexism scale and or the Christian nationalism scale, because some people are 1, some people are 2 of 3, some people are all 3. But being at least one of those accounts for 95% of Trump's white vote, 95%, right? The other 5%, the only thing I can find is an above average income, but that's 95% of the vote. But the number, the raw number of people who feel that way, shrinks as diversity in the country grows, as a younger generation, comes along that doesn't hold. Some of them still hold those attitudes. I don't want to say generational stuff's going to fix it all because it's not true, but it does start to shrink. So you see that population shrinking, right? So that should mean that if you, that it would have somewhat of an expiration date if the vote's not suppressed. That gives that shrinking Southern thing more power than it should have, right? And if everyone else gets on the same page.
Yeah,
so in 2016, the number of people who voted third party in the general election, and I have empathy, I understand, and people get to vote the way they want. I'm just saying this because I don't see it talked about. The number of people who voted third party was greater than the difference between Clinton and Trump in 13 states, and 1 district in Nebraska counts for 151 electoral votes. 151. So what I'm hoping is that people will say, no one person in the White House is going to save any of this. There's one, it can be destroyed the other way, but no one person, like the fight is the fight regardless of if that candidate is flawed. You need the party in power, and you need people working to pull the party in the directions it wants.
Yeah.
So no matter what happens in November, I would just encourage people to continue to push and march and protest and petition and do ballot initiatives and run candidates and vote and get involved and pay attention, because, it's not enough just for party change.
Yeah.
Right? It's what that party does.
Yeah.
With the power, and they will do what pressure they feel.
Yeah. And it's a long game.
They won't move.
It's the long game. Yeah, it's
the long game.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. But it's not all going to happen overnight.
Right.
So what stresses me out, and the Republicans knew this, and they did this in the Long Southern Strategy, is that, everything is not going to magically, happen. It's going to be hard, right? And don't give up.
Right.
Because if we get a 4-year window of progressives in the House and hopefully the Senate and the White House, give them the 4 years, push and pace yourself, and don't give up. Don't get disheartened, because I see people go, see, they didn't do it. They didn't do it. They had the chance. They didn't do it. They will do what they feel pressured to do. You can't let up on the gas.
Yeah.
The Republicans didn't. They didn't.
And that's the important thing, I think, is broader than, to your point, broader than any particular party or any particular. It's really about especially when we're looking at race and oppression, whether it's oppression of women, oppression of race, because of race or ethnicity or any other that we can create, because we always seem to create others no matter what. And so it's really about, the game is dismantling those things through better policy and through engagement and voting and petitioning and protest and all of the things, all the tools it's going to take. It took all the tools to build ourselves as a fundamentally racist nation, and so it's going to take all of those tools and all of our creativity and all of our wisdom.
I'm going to tell you rebuild. You're absolutely right. The one thing that the Republican Party has always done better in the modern era is there's only about 30% of Republicans who voted for Trump in the primaries in 2016, but they all voted for him in the general. It's overwhelming, right? And they will do that on policy, even if it's compromise, it's not exactly what they want. They kind of come together, and I know that's hard, because a lot of times when people on the left and the progressives disagree, their points are very, very valid, and I get it. But we have to take the win sometimes, and keep pushing, Yeah. And so I just really encourage people to think about the big picture and to know that is what the GOP did. It's their playbook. And
it still works. They come together. My family is still is heavily Republican, and when I see their position and I know where they came from, because it took me literally 20 years to kind of become more progressive in my own political views, because I was so indoctrinated with the Republican, what I'm finding is the Southern strategy. And I grew up very fundamental Baptist, so I grew up in that environment, which we didn't really get to tonight. But I think that is what happens is, no matter how someone plugs into the GOP or for whatever reason, whether it's racial angst or it's women and these things, that's the thing that turns the crank for them. And so the GOP is really good about hitting all of those levers.
That's exactly
it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, where they're behind the thing moving the levers, and then the wizard talks. And if you have racial angst, and somebody, our senator, I saw yesterday, I think he did an ad in Minnesota, I think, or Michigan, and at the end he was talking about law and order, and it's him with a big old gun in the military, and it's very clear what he's saying, and it's, they're going to come to your cities and they're going to riot in your cities and all of this, if in his case he was saying if Joe Biden gets elected. And so it's a consistent message that all the politicians can tweak to fit their particular demographic or constituency. But Daniel asked, are you seeing any sort of strong Democratic strategy in the South, local or national?
Yes, I am. I am seeing, if you look at Charles Booker's campaign in Kentucky, right, he's working very hard to say we can build a coalition of working class whites from the mountains, Black Kentuckians, Latino Kentuckians, people that are essential workers. He's saying, we are essential workers and we are kind of rising up. We are seeing some of that kind of populist stuff. We are seeing moms demand action on the issues of, common sense gun control, have amazing progress in the South, even though and that's just, that's an issue, that's issue generated, policy generated, but it's an organizing of a lot of, moms and women and men too, that are getting involved, that were not politically engaged. We've got the turnout in Georgia I hope I'm not getting this wrong, in 2014, because Georgia's had a Senate race, and then they had a special, this is a special Senate race. But anyway, regardless, the turnout in a primary was 200,000 in 2014. They're going to cross 1 million in 2020 in the primary turnout. It's unprecedented, right? And that's the thing, is if Democrats turn out, and independents who lean Democrat, there are very few states that they cannot win.
Well, and that's what, we saw the Obama campaign was able to turn out the voters. They were just able to do. And so it can be done. And I just realized we're crossing an hour, and I knew it. I was like, I'm never going to get through this whole thing. But it was really insightful, as I knew it would be. And I think this is really helpful that we continue to have these conversations and challenge each other. So I appreciate you joining us. And I want to kind of wrap specifically for the audience. Now, we've talked about all of these things and what we can do. And I want to use an analogy from the movie The Matrix, where the character Morpheus offers Neo a blue pill and a red pill. And he says, if you take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. We as white people are the only ones that have had the choice. For those who have been oppressed by injustice, the story didn't end. They don't wake up in their bed safely believing whatever they want to believe. So when we begin to see injustice and oppression, we can't unsee it. We are each compelled to see how deep that rabbit hole goes. And so I compel you, and I encourage you, invite you to look to those who are doing the work. They, particularly Black and brown women, have been doing this for centuries. Listen to their voices. Listen and hear their words.
I would ask you, too, that first I want to tell you that my website is called, and I'm telling you for a reason, masonjarpolitics.com. There's a whole bunch of podcast episodes and stuff I've done. There's some all free, no paywall on anything, that's got some pieces that are short summaries of the book if you don't have time to read that. But I'd rather you take the $15 you'd spend on the Kindle version or the ebook or whatever, or much less the $35 they're charging for a hard copy of my book, and I want you to give it to a woman of color running for office. Find a candidate. And then read everything you can on my website if you want to get a sense of the book, and then get yourself on the library list for it. But give your money to the women of color running in 2020. They need it in Arkansas. Joyce Elliott in the 2nd District running for U.S. House. But there are a record number of women of color running this cycle. Find someone that speaks to you. If you've got the extra dollars, I would just strongly encourage you.
And that's I think, and also one thing that I feel more strongly about, specifically for us who are white and have benefited from these systems that have helped us. One of the most important things, I think, outside of really engaging, is speaking in our circles of white power, speaking up in our places with our family, our friends. That's often the hardest thing to do. And it can be without aggression and without excessive conflict when you're educated, when you have the data, when you have the understanding. So educate yourself and really continue to push forward. I have committed for myself, one thing that's helpful is as my vocabulary begins to expand around these issues, I begin to pay attention to these dog whistle phrases and situations. Now that I have so much more understanding, of course, through this book, seeing what was done, to be able to understand and look, yes, at my individual experience, but then when I hear these things, I immediately can look for how am I being persuaded or manipulated.
Right.
And
it's being a smart consumer.
yes,
It lets you be a smart consumer
absolutely.
of the political rhetoric.
Yes.
And we all have to do that. Our news agency, all of it. We have to be smart consumers of that messaging and how it's working on us.
And then it's really these little steps are every single act of anti-racism is important and it's worth it. And it is, I hope that this conversation is for all of us one little thread in that more perfect union that is real rather than imagined, and that we continue to create it one thread, one brick, one block at a time. Dr. Maxwell, thank you. I appreciate your insight and sharing this hour with us. And for all who joined us on the live stream, I appreciate you staying engaged this hour and sharing your questions and thoughts. And this is our work, and we have to keep it going.
It's our work. Yep.
Good night, everybody.